didn't know it. Might be Gator might have.
Okay, well, I just wanted to thank you for this. Somebody did that. I really appreciate it. I said, I found somebody loves me. That's 2 times somebody done something for me. I mean, paper.
I'm glad for you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good morning. I did not know how many would suffer the weather for our area. This is pretty cold, isn't it? You lived up in northern Michigan, you wouldn't think anything about it, but man, this is cold. I do not like it. And so I told Mary Lou, really my goal now is to get to Valentine's Day. I always feel like I get to middle of February, things start looking better, but I just survived the next 2 months. Is that the way with some of you? I do not like the cold. Hard time, isn't it? You like it. Oh, Troy. Forget Troy. We don't count Troy. There's always this outlier in anything you do. There's these things you throw out. You know, if you're going to do any kind of with figures, you throw out the extremes. We throw him out. Sickness is bad, isn't it? So I did tell your children, tell yourself, your grandchildren, I did not bring the candy this morning purposely because I thought I don't want to be party to maybe spreading germs, and my wife, in fact, got, I believe, bronchitis started yesterday afternoon, so I don't want to do anything to affect that. We're going to start in just a minute with prayer. Some of the ones I want to remember, I still remember, we forget, like my brother-in-law, Steve Hossel. You know, he continues to fight the cancer. And then I have a cousin that I don't think anybody here has met, but Doug Spiceland on my mother's side. And he's much younger than Teresa and I, and he is fighting cancer. And then certainly here, Mary Lou and I were talking today about ones like Charlene Crawford, you know, that we don't see, or we don't get to see your parents. And so there are many that we miss, right? So bow with me. We're going to start the word of prayer, and then we will have a few more comments before we get going. Our Father in heaven, we do thank you for allowing us the opportunity to be here this morning, and we hope and pray that we'll all be safe in this type of weather. We hope that everyone has the methods and means for heating. Father, at this time, we are mindful of those that are physically hurting. As we mentioned, I ask you to be with Steve Hossel. Would ask that you be with Doug Spiceland, be with Miss Crawford and Miss Steele and others that are in the rest homes. Continue to be with Pat McCallan. There are just so many, Father, that we are concerned about. And we want them to know that they're in our hearts and our minds. We're certainly concerned for the spiritual needs. Many that need to name Christ as their Savior, maybe even some in this midst today. We ask that you continue with this congregation here at Northside. It is our sincere desire that we could preach the gospel to others, that obviously we'll go to heaven, and that we will take as many with us as is possible. Please help us. Please help us in all the classes today. Forgive us when we sin, Father, and in Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right, so Daniel and Allison, did you enjoy the Christmas party last night? It lasted 2 hours, 38 minutes, and 30 seconds. You know how I know? Because I had two of the grandchildren. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So I had the two youngest. Abby wanted to go and obviously play, and so Tracy being sick, I can handle this. Daniel, we passed kidney stones. Man, I can take care of a nine-month-old and a 6-month-old, right? Let me just say, it was interesting. I do it all the time with Tracy, and I think I'm really taking the lead, but I found out last night how little I do. So even after they left, I was impressed with myself when I looked. There are 2 bottles there that were emptied, and I don't even know when I gave it to them. And then I looked there in the trash, and there is a dirty diaper and a regular diaper. Man, I'm something else. These acts of heroism that you can do, you know, when you're just hitting it hard. But I told y'all last week, poor little Canaan, Addie is just such a go-getter. And so I do remember I was trying to feed him a bottle, and you feel so sad. You're sitting there, and here she comes up to my leg, you know, crawls on the floor, and she's trying to get up, and she sees that bottle, and she wants it right. I thought, what am I going to do? I get my mind think, puffs. So I went and got a handful of puffs, and come on, don't knock me. I threw them on the floor, and I make her get yeah. And she was loving it. And I got to thinking, I got to looking at, he wasn't taking this very fast, and I didn't even know if I have enough puffs, so you're trying to figure out, you know what. So she got her fill of puffs, and he got the bottle, and I remember thinking things were leveling out, but she wanted to be up my lap, so I don't know how I did it, but I reached down and got her, and I had her on this side, but you have to hold her way apart because she's trying to grab for me. Remember I told you all that last week? If that little toot, I thought I had her weight, and she reached over, and he had to pass in, and if she didn't pop that thing out, and it goes to the floor, and I'm thinking I only got 5 seconds to pick it up, or I've got to sterilize it, right? So it was crazy, the things that happened. Well, Tracy has no clue, unless she's watching right now. She has no clue what took place in that 2 hours and 38 minutes, nor do the parents. I do love my daughter-in-law, and I do love my daughter, but I don't know if I've loved her any more than when they got there after the party and came in that door to pick up those 2 kids. You know, oh, my goodness. It was interesting. I wouldn't take anything for it, but at the very time, it really is like you're in a battle. You know, you're down in the trenches, aren't you, guys? Oh, man. All right, let's get started. Do you remember last week that we started in? We were trying to, if you say mesh, the New and the Old Testament, and I wanted to stress the importance of the Old Testament. Do you remember that? Chris and I had not talked at all. Did anybody else? I took pride when he got up there. Do you remember, as soon as he got up, where he said we were going to start last week? He said, we're going to look at Luke chapter 17 and verse 32. And this is a verse I can even memorize. Do you remember he said this? And the verse was, remember Lot's wife. And I thought, that's exactly what I'm saying. How can you know what Chris Kemp was going to speak about unless you understood that topic, right? And so I thought that is so interesting that just a matter of minutes after we discussed that he proved how important the Old Testament is. And obviously, Christ speaking there knew that they knew about Lot's wife, and he was building on it. And then he spent a lot of time in Genesis last week, didn't he? About Lot's wife and how the story from that is not just listening to God, but specifically, don't look back. And so I thought that was interesting, proving out what we discussed. So today we're going to do whatever time we have here, we're going to work in the book of Genesis, cover what we cover, and then next week we move on. That's the way this is going to work over the next few weeks, okay? So turn to Genesis. Some of this you'll remember if you happen to be here 3.5, 4 years ago, whenever it was when we studied it, but there may be new ones here. Also, if you're like me, what do? You forget. I was reminded how much I forget this week because I got out my tractor and I've had it like 11 years. And literally, I had made notes in my manuals and stuff that it was like news to me what I'd written. I thought, that proves that I'm telling you that time goes by, I forget. I couldn't even remember what I'd written 11 years ago. All right, Genesis. It is the book of what? Starts with the letter B. The book of the beginnings, of origins. And if you want to, does anybody want to speculate? I may have mentioned last week, if you can get within 3,000 years, you're close enough of when most people believe Genesis, the time frame is at the start of Genesis chapter 1. Anybody want to guess, speculate? An archbishop in the 1600s put a specific date that always amazed me. He gets it down to the exact year he thinks. He says 4004, but most theologians say you can't be that close. But it's not likely to be more than 7,000 BC, okay? Have you ever heard that before? That the earth is probably from 6 to 7 to 8 to 9,000 years old, not millions of years. And the point about that is people are going to always say, well, look at all these ravines and look at all these things they find. Well, first of all, God made in His fullness. But the other thing is, I don't know that flood, and it doesn't compare to what we have now, the flooding that happened this summer did not prove in a matter of hours how much it can change things and sweep things away. So don't let you ever be persuaded by people of the world that this earth is millions and millions of years old. There's just no indication for that. The Bible calls this the creation and when things were beginning, and then immediately goes into Adam and Eve, and we follow with these genealogies. They're not going to convince me it's millions of years old. Now, if you want to argue with me whether it's 6,000 or 9,000, have at it. I can't tell you. The book of beginnings. It is one of the 5 books that Moses is attributed. Obviously, he was inspired to write these and record these. Some of this, it's confident that he would have heard over the years being of his lineage. But Genesis chapter 1, what do we have? What's the overall theme of Genesis chapter 1? Creation. Thank you, Chris. So we have the creation, and the really important thing, what happened on day 6? Who was created? Yeah, man was created. This is where, and I would have pointed this out a few years ago, but I'm going to point it out again because we are struggling with this, not only in this country but worldwide. Look with me, Genesis chapter 1. Go to verse 26. Very important. And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. So we do have attributes. We do have things about us that are like the Godhead. And let them have, the King James says, the word that starts with the letter D. Dominion. What does that mean? We are not to be under an animal, or we are not supposed to be equated with an animal. Now, Mary Lou and I were talking today about how much she doesn't like animals to be mistreated. I agree, but I'm going to tell you what. We are in terrible shape when people equate or even elevate animals above human beings. And in this country, we're fighting that problem. So look, Tracy has a cat right now that, man, it's cost us a lot of money. And so she likes that cat. I'm glad she likes it, but that cat does not even compare to our grandchildren, for example. Doesn't compare to any of you. So dominion, it's important that we recognize this. You have maybe it's an isolated group, but you have enough people in this country that are pushing and have gotten through that there are laws, you know this. I'm more in trouble if I do something to a bald eagle than I am if I did something to one of you. It's just crazy. We have lost all sense of reality. And then I like verse 27. You cannot preach this enough in these day and times. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. I'm not going to put up with this nonsense, as I've mentioned earlier about, I think I did last week, about these adverbs and the way you describe people and things. No. Male and female. And God blessed them in verse 28, and he says, be fruitful and multiply. And then replenish the earth, but also, King James says, subdue it, rule over it. We have the right, we have the authority from God to take things. Now, I want to be responsible, but I have no issue with us cutting down trees at some point. Look, I like my trees out there. Don't come to my house, I've said this, and you cut down an oak tree, okay? Work too hard to save that tornado. But I have no issue with us harvesting properly trees. If you do, you need to listen to this. If you think it's wrong to ride a horse to get a job done, man, you need to read this. Don't let the world indoctrinate us. We have the right to go out and fish and feed ourselves. There's just no way to, if you believe the Bible, you have to believe this, and we have dominion over it. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about that. And it is continued in the New Testament with our dominion, with the way disciples and Christ do their teachings, and they don't backtrack on any of this. Any thought? Chapter 2 is the Garden of Eden. Only one tree man had to avoid, right? Only one. So, I mean, think about the kids last night. There really was, most of the time, only one thing I was not wanting Addie to touch. And that was the one thing she was determined to touch, and that was Canaan. I mean, the more I kept him away from her, the more I'm telling you, man, she was determined she was going to get to him. It's in our minds, isn't it? Whatever we're not supposed to have, and it comes from this right here. One thing they were told they couldn't have, and once they did, we see in chapter 3, the fall of man, as it ends up following up with the serpent. People are not going to like it. I'm going to go ahead and talk about it under the curse. Again, we are moving quickly. If you think, well, I missed some things, I've just got to do this. Chapter 3, look at verse 14. And the Lord said unto the serpent, because thou hast done this, thou art cursed above all cattle and above every beast of the field. Upon thy belly thou shalt go. I mean, with the majority of us, isn't a snake, for most people, isn't a snake about as hated as you can possibly get? It really is. This is true. And then for the woman, in verse 16, unto the woman he said, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children. And thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. And we cannot deny that. It's interesting in the New Testament. Chris, I think it was last week, talked about how terrible women were treated in the Old Testament in most cases. And the New, they've been elevated, and that is correct. Because Christ says, for a man, you know, you're treating that bride, that a man really should treat his wife like Christ treats the church. That he was willing to die, right? And so, but, in the proper home, the man from this point, and continuing with what we see in the New Testament, he has a responsibility different from the wife. And she has a responsibility to heed to him. But it's not in the lording over method. And that's what Chris was really meaning. He didn't have time to teach about last week. But woman, you're elevated by the way this relationship is if you will accept what it means. I mean, Christ willing to die for the church. A man should be willing to die for his wife, for his family, right? That is not an insult. Don't take it that way, although the world will act like you're being devalued. That is not true at all. You must read the Bible and read especially how then Christ talks about this marriage relationship and the responsibility you have. And he went on to say, hey, Moses allowed some things that not the way it is. That man makes a commitment to that wife. That's who he's committed to. Don't you be just frivolously getting rid of somebody. So, what about man? Is he innocent? Absolutely not. Verses 18, or really starting in 17, When it comes to work, thou shalt not eat of it. Curses the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth to thee. And thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread until you return to the ground. And man, I'll tell you one thing, I've had to work my life. Sweat. Even yesterday, I was working with a tractor, and one of the reasons I want that tractor is, man, I'm fighting all the time. Thistles, briars, in our fence rows, it's just a continual fight, where if Adam and Eve would have kept everything right, man, we could have just easily dressed the ground and taken care of things, but no. Make it to heaven, and Adam and Eve are there. I'm going to have to talk to them a little bit, aren't you guys? Man, it's a lot of time we spend. You could spend all your time just planting flowers, Daniel, if it weren't for this thing about thistles and weeds and things like that, right? Okay, any thoughts? Chapter 4, lesson I get from this, before we even get to the point of the murder. Are you in agreement that there are lots of people that worship God in different manners? And are you in agreement that, generally speaking, in the religious world, most would say, hey, anything counts, anything goes? But one of the things I'm convinced we have chapter 4 about is, and I wrote it in years ago, acceptable sacrifice or worship. When I read this about Cain and Abel, I would have been okay myself with the sacrifice being that of the ground, of the fruits. But did God accept it? And so you and I, why am I bringing this up? Are we not tempted sometimes to think, hey, just any way I worship will be okay? I sure hope, me personally, I'm hoping that I misunderstand a lot of things and there's a lot more flexibility in worship than what I think it is. But man, chapter 4, why would it be given to us like that? Why even put in here that there can be an unacceptable sacrifice if it's not got some meaning for people? Let's say it again. Okay, and some will bring up even, we know this, she's talking about it's got to be from the heart. And somebody may bring up this passage that may not have just been where the sacrifice came from, but also the heart. And that would even include, though, evidently he knew that wasn't where he's supposed to get the sacrifice from, which means, again, the heart, he was going to do it his way instead of God's way. Cain killed who? First murder we have recorded was of siblings. And right behind that would have been cousins that I about witnessed last night, right? Okay? So Cain killed Abel, terrible thing. And that verse 9 we talk about, am I my brother's keeper? And it's funny how he asked a question, but really he knew the answer, and he really answered himself, didn't he? Absolutely, we have a responsibility. Chris probably stated more than anybody else, or tried to through the years. Is it likely we're going to get to heaven by ourselves, Chris? When you read the Bible, you are your brother's keeper. You are responsible for helping them. We're not to put stumbling blocks. We're supposed to try to help them, assist them. And certainly this is the polar opposite. He killed. All right, chapter 5, you have the descendants of Adam, and verse 2 beats in another point again. Male and female created he them. Verse 24 of 5, Enoch walked with God. Methuselah, verse 27. You know what? A lot of times we'll say, good old Methuselah. I don't know if Methuselah was good or not. I've tried after thinking, has anybody ever thought about this before? We act like Methuselah was great. I don't know if he was. I tried to, huh? Yeah, he was old, but old does not necessarily make us good, does it? Don't tell my kids I said that, because I tell them being old automatically means, you elevate. But anyway, Methuselah, all right, made a long time. So we have the earth created, let's say 4,000 or 5,000 BC before Christ. And we're really confident that when we get down to Abraham, it's about 2,000 years before Christ. So in that period in between, how did man do in God's eyes? What do you see in chapter 6? My Bible titles it, Wickedness of Mankind. So God creates man, Adam and Eve mess up. Hopefully that's the last little glitch. Man's going to do better. No. How upset does God get with them? Verse 5. What does it say? He saw chapter 6, verse 5. If you're moving along quickly with me. Man's imagination and thoughts of his heart were on evil continually. And the Lord in verse 6 says it was grieved. He grieved in his heart. And the Lord said in verse 7, I will destroy man. Which brings out another point to me. So many people will say, God is such a loving God, He will not destroy, He will not send people to hell. That's not the, did He hesitate to wipe out all of mankind with the exception of, 8 souls? Lots of people. And people argue, well, God won't condemn others. Brought this flood on, and He took care of them, didn't He? It's an interesting point in verse 3 of chapter 6. The Lord said, my spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. I've always taken that to be, that's where you see one of these times where instead of Methuselah's age, drops down and man's going to live shorter and shorter. I still believe that's right, but some would argue that 120 years here is in reference to the time of the flood, that this was 120 years before. Anybody else ever heard that before? Okay? Whether that's right or not, I've always taken it to be because we see this shortened length of man's life, his span. And so we have Noah commanded to make the ark, and he does so. I don't know where I picked it up, but for years I've always thought it took him 100 years to build the ark. And I read up on that some more in preparation, and you can't find that specifically in the Bible. There's references that imply it might have been, but we know it took him quite a while, decades and decades, and he gets in this ark, and he takes in, we always say 2 by 2, the animals, but we also know some went in by 7s, right? If you want to study on that. Has anybody made the trip up in Kentucky to the ark? Is it pretty neat? I keep thinking I'm going to get to it, and I guess I'll wait till I get old and I'll finally go up there or something. So that was sarcasm. I'm already there. Okay. So built the ark, God shut them in, and the notes I made in chapter 8 several years ago, when you get to verse 13, it says, and it came to pass in the 600th and first year in the first month, the first day of the month, the waters were dried up from off the earth. I made a note. It's a little bit confusing whether the time on the ark was 1 year, 10 days, or 1 year, 17 days, and it has to deal with like how many days they were on the ark before the rains ever started and all that. But that's about the time period on that. So, again, referring to the floods we saw this year, if you have a flood so big, can you imagine the currents, the way the water was moving? And people wonder why you find things buried as they are. There are people that have not been found from not just the Texas flood, but the hurricane floods, right? They've not been found, and probably never will in our lifetime. And even when they're finding things, they're finding that it's like they can't believe how far some of these things are submerged. And so you get these different layers and things. So don't let people fool you about trying to date things because they found it in some area that they're convinced is millions of years ago. All right, chapter 9. We don't need to be embarrassed about verse 13. They get off this ark, and God gives a sign in verse 13. I set the rainbow, right? So we know the earth will never be taken over by floods in the same way. It won't be destroyed. And so if you have all these catastrophic floods and people talk about all the water levels are rising, I'm confident that's not how this earth is going to end. I can tell you that. I'm confident. It's not going to end because the icebergs are all going to melt down. It's going to float us all away. That is not going to happen. We're not going to have that. The way I look at it. Noah has some problems with drunkenness. One of his sons sees him, his nakedness, and that's what you see in chapter 10. When I get to chapter 11, anybody got a topic? Are you learning anything? Are we going so fast or not? Are we learning anything, or is everybody going to sleep? You doing okay? All right. I'm trying to get this. We're quickly covering time, okay? We are quickly moving along. Noah's probably about 2400 BC, what they think. So we have gone from 4, 5, 6, 7,000 BC. All of a sudden now we're down at 2400, more in our neck of the woods. So we get here to chapter 11. Man gets pretty cocky sometimes, don't we? I think we're pretty cocky right now with all we think we can do. And I saw that one of the satellites or something is so far out there that sometime next year it'll be a light year away. You know, it's crazy. Chapter 11, what is God going to introduce to keep man from being quite so cocky? You know? Still happens to us today. This is still a barrier, if you will. Anybody know? Language. And it's crazy. It's not just within, you know, we think, I'm talking about English versus Spanish or French or something. Come on, even within the English. You talk to some of my mother's folks from Land Between the Lakes, and people might have a hard time understanding. They're much like Appalachia. And so, I'll tell you this. Those of us who are more mature, is it sometimes for us even hard to understand the young people? And it's not just because they're here. No, it really is. What are they saying? And so God intentionally put man back in his place by introducing some language to confound, to keep man from being quite as smooth as he might be. Because they were going to build this tower and just keep going with it. Well, we got the Tower of Babel. So don't we say somebody's babbling like I am today? Right? You're going to leave here and say, well, Jason was babbling. Well, not quite the same words, but the thought. Chapter 12. This is where, if you were a Jew, you really get interested. Who comes on the scene? Abraham. And at this time, obviously, it's called Abram. And I've tried to get across, anytime I have a chance, I try to remind people, the basic concept is it's a three-pronged promise that God makes with this man Abram that he loves so much. He makes a special covenant, three-pronged. One of the, I'm telling you right now, it's still an issue to this day because they still believe this, that they still are entitled to it. And I want the country of Israel to exist, don't get me wrong. But they were to get a land. There to be a great people. And what's really most important to us is what was the final one. Through them, through that lineage, who would come. Everybody be blessed because of Christ. And remember, I've talked this when I did the class before. This is made here as this covenant, this promise. But start studying on your own and see how many times the covenant has to be renewed. And when you read about the sacrifice or the near sacrifice of Isaac, that's when God says, hey, now I know, Abraham, now I know that you believe me. Now I know that you're going to fulfill your agreement with me. And so why do I bring that up? Because I am, what do they call it? Not diametric. What do they say when you completely opposed to something? Diabolically? Something. You're opposed to something? I am in shock when people continue to say, once saved, always saved, and that God will not allow you to go astray. You're automatically saved. It is absolutely contrary to what I find in the Bible. And I've tried to research this so that I want to see some good explanation. They cannot make one that makes sense. From the beginning here, we have an example. He made the first covenant with Adam and Eve, didn't he? We'll put you in here and you dress this, keep this tended, and just leave the one thing alone. You got it made. And once they messed up, that covenant was null and void. And so with Abraham, if Abraham had not done what he was supposed to, which is to go where God told him, continue to abide by what God wanted him to do, covenant would have been null and void. The Israelites, the Jews today, unfortunately, still don't get that. They don't get that covenant became null and void. That agreement went after Acts chapter 2 between there and chapter 10 of Acts. When they didn't accept it, then God says, hey, we're going out to everybody. That's what we see in Acts chapter 10. So, all right. Abraham in 13 would be he and Lot. And again, if you listened last week to Chris, this is where he began talking about some things. And with Lot, Lot chose to go to Sodom and Gomorrah, the plain there, the better land. And he ended up having the wickedness. And remember God, when Lot asked him, Abraham asked, hey, you're going down there where Lot is. For just 50 righteous people will you save? Okay, I won't destroy it. And then 40 and 30 keeps coming down, even down to 10. And we know that in Sodom and Gomorrah, in that town of Sodom, there weren't even 10 righteous souls, or it wouldn't have been destroyed, right? Okay. Now, to have this covenant with Abraham to be a great nation, what must necessarily follow? What must Abraham have? At the time he made this, remember, he has none of them. What's he got to finally have? He and his wife. To have a great nation of people, what's he going to have? Goes along with what I've been talking about and making fun of this morning. Going to have what now? Heirs. That's right. And so Abraham, getting on up in age, and at 86 years of age, he still hadn't got that. So remember what happens? He was given he went into, not his wife, but to a handmaid and a maiden, however you say that. And Ishmael came about, right? And Abraham thought this was going to be who the lineage would be through. And God says, no, this is not it, which really blew Abraham's mind. Because, come on. I already told you last night, I had a hard time with a 6-month-old and a 9-month-old, and I'm not near as old as Abraham, and I was only doing it for 2 hours, 38 minutes, and 30 seconds, whatever that time was, okay? So you're thinking, this is not going to happen. We do know through Ishmael that a great lineage did come about. I think I alluded to this last week, but Muhammad claims it through Ishmael. That's why he claims Abraham. Not all Arabs came from Ishmael, but some did. And if you say, well, I don't understand that, okay, come on, in the United States, don't we have Indians? We just say we got Indians. But they're not, there's Apache, and we have Iroquois, and we have in Carolinas, Cherokee. Go down to Florida, you have different ones, right? The Sioux out west. We lump them all as Indian, but they're not of identical lineage. And in fact, I would argue if you go down the Apaches, don't they look a little bit more like Hispanic people in their size and stature? And when you go further north, a lot of them became taller and more hawk-nosed like me and things, so right? Okay, so all Arabs do not come from Ishmael based on what I understand, but a large number of them do, and specifically Muhammad claims his through that. When Abraham was 99, he finds out, hey, it's time for you to have this son. I remember right, Sarah was like 10 years or 9 years younger. Anyway, something like that. And she laughed when that was presented to her, and because of that, she had a little bit of a tougher pregnancy than other people would have. Right? Abraham had a better pregnancy. If you don't know that joke I've just made, you're going to have to go back and study this passage to understand why the pregnancy was a little better for Abraham than normally. Anybody want to venture why? Come on, men. Toughen up here. Okay. You can think on your own to do that. So, let's keep going along. 18 and verse 20 is that passage I remember about Sodom and Gomorrah. And the Lord said, because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, because their sin is very grievous. And you can follow up and see how homosexuality was a problem there. And when people tell you that homosexuality is not found in the Bible, what they're being very specific about is the word homosexual. No, that didn't come about. That's a relatively new term compared to thousands of years ago. But we know what being homosexual and gay and lesbian and what this means. It is an attraction to those of the same sex and to the point of sexual things done that are not, shouldn't be done. Well, when they say it's not found, my goodness, all you got to do is go back to these chapters 19, 20 along through there, and you can find out. Doesn't matter what it's called, it's the same sin, and 2 cities are destroyed utterly from the face of the earth. Okay? All right, and again we have here where Lot's wife looked back and became the pillar of salt, as Chris alluded to last week, and I'm like him, I don't know exactly what that means. I do picture something kind of a dingy white color that was in her body form, and whether you could have just gone up there and started wiping it off, I don't know. I wiped off some sheetrock. I'd put some little sheetrock mud in some blemishes that the grandkids had made. I got to keep, I'm all the time repairing, doing things about that. And how you can just kind of go up and wipe it off. Have you mudded anything before? And you mud it, and you can, once it dries, you just kind of go up there. It's solid, but you can kind of wipe it off. That's kind of how in my mind I picture. I don't know if that's right or not. Chapter 21, we have the birth of Isaac. We also, in these passages along through here, we're really seeing that covenant. There's a physical thing that Abraham and the other men had to go through that also became even a topic of discussion in the New Testament with Peter and Paul and some of the others. You know what that was? And Moses was very old when he had it happen to him. Circumcision. And so I think that's, to me, some kind of a passage that lets us know that physically there are things God expects of you to prove your allegiance to Him. People don't like that being said in the New Testament. And people don't like it when we say you're supposed to be baptized for the remission of sins, that showing that outward act. We have some examples here. Circumcision is one of them. 22, we have Abraham willing to sacrifice Isaac. And Isaac this time is older than people think. I studied this before and told y'all he's probably not a young lad like people really say. He's probably more 20-ish, upper teens or so, most likely. Chapter 4, beginning in chapter 24, is when we start seeing really Isaac coming to manhood. And remember, the three patriarchs. Got to go through this quickly. Three patriarchs. Abraham, what's the next two? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, okay? So if you start along here in the middle 20s and go from here through about chapter 37, 36, whatever it is, it's events in Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and you'll have a little bit of the predecessor. If it's going around Jacob, you'll hear a little bit about Isaac and his death, for example. But if you want to study about the three patriarchs that's really seems to be the center of the patriarchal period, it's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And they're from Genesis, about halfway through Genesis is when they begin. Abraham started in 12. But I mean, when we start seeing Isaac and Jacob and finishing out these three are really, where they're all three involved, becomes in chapter 25 through 36, 37. Make sense? So, why am I saying this? If you were trying to study with somebody and you're trying to think, man, I don't remember Christ's lineage and where did all this come about? Where was that thing they talked about on the patriarchs? If you don't have your phone handy, just start thinking in your mind that way. That's what I do. If Daniel were to come up and ask me something and he didn't want me to look at my phone, my mind's going to start, these wheels going to start turning. Wait a minute. Abraham was chapter 12. We have, because he's so important, we have him for 12 or 13 chapters. It's mainly just him. And then all of a sudden, Isaac gets involved, and then Jacob. And we also have about Esau, the Edomites. And that's what goes along. So we got to switch now let's get to chapter about 37. And who comes on the scene here? Jacob's son. Says in verse 3 who he is. Chapter 37, verse 3. So I know you're with me. Somebody say it. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than all his children. I tried to envision Joseph, and I tried to mimic him today. See this shirt? I think when I put this on, I kind of feel like Paul Bunyan. I don't know why. When I got this shirt on, I feel like I need to go out and chop wood or something. So it makes me feel like a real man. Joseph had this coat of many colors, right? And we picture brighter, more brilliant than this, but that concept, don't we? Stripes may be different. We had this coat of many colors. Made him stand out. It was easy to recognize him. Sometimes in our families, we don't know when to keep our mouth shut. Okay? Yeah. Sometimes it's me. Sometimes it's Teresa. Most of the time it's Teresa. No, it's not. I do. I'll talk. I'll blurt something out. Why in the world did Joseph have to blurt out that he had two dreams and tell this to his brothers that one of them is where the sheaves bow down to his sheaf? And then to add insult to injury, he comes along in this chapter and he says, not only that, but I had one where the number of stars and the moon and the sun bowed down to me, which was referencing his parents. And now how are you going to, Teresa, say something like that to me and see how upset I'm going to be, right? I won't like that. So we always say Joseph really, we don't see him as committing any sins or whatever, but man, he sure made a foolish couple statements there, I think, as a young man in chapter 37.
But God intended it. If he hadn't made those statements, he wouldn't have been sold into slavery and saved his brothers and family.
That's right. So there are all kinds of things. What Daniel's brought up, God wanted this to happen. You get into that I don't know the answer, but over and over in the Bible, there are things like, people are trying to argue sometimes that something is right because God allowed it to happen. But he'll use kings throughout the Old Testament that are evil kings, but it worked in his plan. And you and I even have to be careful. Come on. I'm going to use right now. Some people are saying, remember, I voted for President Trump, but I'm telling you, some people say that God sent him, and they say it elevating him like he's a man of God. I don't see that. If you say that God is using him maybe, possibly, to get us going back in the right direction in some areas, okay, that's a different statement, right? So anyway, Daniel made a good statement that it is amazing that there are things we see in the Old Testament that God needed to take place. That was his plan. But that doesn't always mean that that's what he wants us to do. Because I don't think he means for us to brag about, I don't think I'm supposed to brag to Teresa about all the things where I'm higher than her, right? Or her higher than me. Well, Joseph getting to the land of Egypt saved his family from the famine, elevated him to second in command. And those same brothers that put him into bondage, what came to fruition as you get to the latter part, these latter chapters out of these 50 chapters in Genesis, occurred. Did his brothers not come and bow down to him? He was second in command in Egypt, only to Pharaoh. He had a hard time getting to that point. If you don't know what I'm talking about, read in how he was mistreated. Read how Joseph was unjustly called that he did something he didn't do. Joseph persevered, and ultimately he saved his family, moved his dad there and all the host. And they ended up in Egypt. And that's going to set us up for the next book, which is called what? Genesis then. So they get to this country of Egypt. Joseph is there. 400 years roughly pass, 350, 400 years pass. And they're going to need to exit out of there, right? And that's what we're going to try to get into next week. We're going to try to just quickly cover Exodus and Leviticus. Did we learn anything today? Not just about my babysitting rules and habits, but what? We learned some other things? Okay. Recap, that's right. I think before it took us 6 months or longer to do what we cover today in one chapter. All right. Thank you all for being here, guys.